Chapter 4 of What I Believe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Believe by Count Leo Tolstoy. Translated from the Russian by Konstantin Popov. Read by David Barnes. Chapter 4. Now I understood what Christ meant when he said, "You have heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. And I say to you, do not resist evil." Christ means, you have been taught to consider it right and rational to protect yourselves against evil by violence, to pluck out an eye for an eye, to institute courts of law for the punishment of criminals, and to have a police and an army to defend you against the attacks of an enemy. But I say to you, do no violence to any man, take no part in violence, never do evil to any man, not even to those whom you call your enemies. I now understood that in this doctrine of non-resistance, Christ not only tells us what the natural result of following his doctrine will be, but by placing this same doctrine in opposition to the Mosaic law, the Roman law, and the various codes of the present time, he clearly shows us that it ought to be the basis of our social existence, and should deliver us from the evil we have brought on ourselves. He says, "You think to amend evil by your laws, but they only aggravate it. There is one way by which you can put a stop to evil. It is by indiscriminatingly returning good for evil. You have tried the other law for thousands of years, now try mine, which is the very reverse." Strange to say, I have had frequent opportunities lately of conversing with men of diverse opinions on this doctrine of non-resistance. I have met with some who agreed with me, though these have been few. But there are two orders of men who always refuse to admit, even in principle, a direct understanding of this doctrine, and warmly uphold the justice of resisting evil. They are men belonging to two extreme poles: our Christian conservative patriots, who consider their church as the true orthodox one, and our revolutionary atheists. Neither the former nor the latter will give up their right to resist by violence what they consider as evil. Even their cleverest, most learned men close their eyes to the simple, self-evident truth, that if we admit the right of one man to resist what he considers as evil by violence, we cannot refuse another the right to resist by violence what he in his turn may consider as evil. A short time ago I met with a correspondence particularly instructive as bearing on this very point. It was carried on between an Orthodox Slavophile and a Christian revolutionist. The former excused the violence of war in the name of his oppressed Slavonian brethren, and the latter vindicated the violence of the revolution in the name of his oppressed brethren, the Russian peasants. Both admit the necessity for violence, and both ground their reasoning on the doctrine of Christ. Each of us gives the doctrine of Christ an interpretation of his own, but it is never the direct and simple one that flows out of his words. We have grounded the conduct of our lives on a principle that he rejects. We do not choose to understand his teaching in its simple and direct sense. Those who call themselves believers believe that Christ God, the second person of the Trinity, made himself man in order to set us an example how to live, and they strictly fulfill the most complicated duties, such as preparing for the sacraments, building churches, sending out missionaries, naming pastors for parochial administration, etc. They forget only one trifling circumstance: to do as he tells them. Unbelievers, on the other hand, try to regulate their lives somehow or other, but not in accordance with the law of Christ, feeling convinced beforehand that it is worthless. Nobody ever tries to fulfill his teaching. Nor is that all. Instead of making any effort to follow his commandments, both believers and unbelievers decide beforehand that to do so is impossible. Christ says that the law of resistance by violence, which you have made the basis of your lives, is unnatural and wrong, and he gives us instead the law of non-resistance, which, he tells us, can alone deliver us from evil. He says, "You think to eradicate evil by your human laws of violence. They only increase it. During thousands and thousands of years you have tried to annihilate evil by evil, and you have not annihilated it, you have but increased it. Follow the teaching I give you by word and deed, and you will prove its practical power." Not only does he speak thus, but he also remains true to his own doctrine not to resist evil in his life and in his death. Believers take all this in with their ears, and hear it read in churches, calling it the Word of God. They call him God, and then they say, "His doctrine is sublime, but the organization of our lives renders its observance impossible. It would change the whole course of our lives, to which we are so used, and with which we are so satisfied. Therefore, we believe in this doctrine only as an ideal that mankind must strive after, an ideal that is to be attained by prayer, by believing in the sacraments, in redemption, and in the resurrection of the dead." Others, unbelievers, the free interpreters of Christ's doctrine, the historians of religion, Strauss, Renan, and others, adopting the interpretation of the Church that this doctrine has no direct application to life, and is only an ideal teaching that can only serve to console the weak-minded, say, very seriously, that the doctrine of Christ was all very well for the savage population of the deserts of Galilee, but that we, with our civilization, can only consider it as a lovely reverie du charmant docteur, as Renan calls him. According to their opinion, Christ could not attain the height of understanding all the wisdom of our civilization and refinement. If he had stood on the same scale of civilization as these learned men, he would not have uttered those pretty trifles about the birds of the air, about letting one's cheek be struck, and about taking no care for tomorrow. Learned historians judge Christianity according to what they see in our Christian society. Now the Christian society of our times considers our life as a good and holy one, with its institutions of solitary imprisonment, of fortresses, sweatshops, journals, brothels, and parliaments, while it only borrows from the doctrine of Christ what is not against these habits of life. And, as Christ's teaching is in direct opposition to all this, nothing is taken from that teaching but its mere words. The learned historians see this, and, not having the same interest in concealing the fact as the so-called believers have, they subject this, for them meaningless doctrine of Christ, to a profound analysis, argue against it, and prove on good grounds that Christianity never was anything but the dream of an idealist. And yet it seems to me that before pronouncing an opinion upon the doctrine of Christ, we ought clearly to understand what it is. And in order to decide whether his teaching is rational or not, it is necessary first of all to believe that he meant exactly what he said. This is just what neither the interpreters of the Church nor free thinkers do, and the reason why is not hard to see. We know very well that the teaching of Christ, as we have received it, embraces all the errors into which humanity has fallen, all the toga, empty idols, the existence of which we try to justify by calling them church, government, culture, science, arts, and civilization, thinking thus to exclude them from the rank of errors. But Christ warns us